Marcus Thompson never believed in ghosts, but he was about to discover that some hauntings aren't supernatural, they're human. When a 2,400-acre ranch in rural Montana sold for $7 at a county auction, everyone said it was cursed. The locals whispered about strange lights, unexplained sounds, and families who'd fled in the middle of the night. But Marcus saw opportunity where others saw omens. What he found there would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, family, and the true meaning of home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The courthouse steps in Millfield County were slick with October rain when Marcus Thompson pulled up in his battered Ford pickup. The engine coughed twice before dying, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past 6 months of driving from auction to auction across Montana. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the weathered confidence of a man who'd learned to read opportunity in other people's disasters. The crowd gathered on the courthouse steps was smaller than usual. Maybe 24 people, most of them local real estate vultures and curious townspeople seeking entertainment on a dreary Tuesday morning. Marcus recognized the type. He'd been one of them for 3 years now, ever since the oil refinery in Billings had laid him off, along with 200 other workers. Lot 47, called the auctioneer, a thin man named Hartwell who'd been running county auctions for 15 years. The Blackwood Ranch property, 2,400 acres, including main house, barn structures, and water rights. His voice carried a note of resignation, as if he already knew how this would, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus noticed more than a few making subtle gestures, touching crosses at their necks, tapping knuckles against wood railings. The superstitious telltales of a community that believed in things beyond. Bank statements and property taxes. Opening bid is $500, Hartwell continued, scanning the crowd with practiced eyes. Silence. Marcus had done his research. The Blackwood Ranch had been on the county's delinquent tax list for 18 months. The previous owner, a man named William Blackwood, had disappeared one winter night, leaving behind only unpaid bills and stories that grew stranger with each telling. 3 families had tried to purchase and occupy the property since then. Each had left within weeks, claiming the place was wrong in ways they couldn't explain. 400? Hartwell's voice carried a hint of desperation. More silence. An elderly woman in a yellow raincoat whispered something to her companion, who shook his head firmly. Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Lights in the windows, children crying. That poor woman. $100. Hartwell tried again, his voice echoing off the wet stone steps. Marcus studied the faces around him. Fear. Genuine, bone-deep fear. Not the kind that came from financial risk or property complications, but something more primal. These people weren't avoiding the auction because of money. They were avoiding it because they truly believed something malevolent waited on that ranch. $50, Hartwell said, his professional composure beginning to crack. This was Marcus's moment. He'd learned to recognize it over dozens of auctions, the point where rationality met superstition, and superstition usually won. He'd built his modest real estate portfolio on other people's irrational fears. A supposedly haunted farmhouse in Bozeman had netted him $15,000 after 6 months of renovations. A cursed warehouse in Great Falls had become a profitable storage facility, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way the elderly woman clutched her companion's arm when she whispered. Maybe it was the complete absence of other bidders. Usually, there was at least one other opportunist willing to gamble on a property this size. Maybe it was the auctioneer's obvious reluctance to be conducting this sale at all. $25, Hartwell said, his voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the courthouse roof. Marcus raised his hand. We have 25, do I? Here 30? The crowd turned to look at him, and Marcus felt the weight of their stares. Some faces showed pity, others showed disapproval, and a few showed genuine concern. An older man in a worn Carhartt jacket stepped closer. "Son," the man said quietly, "you don't want that place. Trust me on this." Marcus met his eyes. "Why's that?" "Because some things ain't meant to be disturbed. That ranch, it's got a darkness to it. Has since old Blackwood vanished, maybe before." $10, Hartwell called out, ignoring the conversation. "Do I hear $10? Marcus studied the man's face, weathered and honest, eyes that had seen too much to lie about small things. "What kind of darkness?" "The kind that makes families pack up in the middle of the night and drive away without looking back. The kind that—" $7, Hartwell's voice cut through the rain. $7 for 2,400 acres. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Even the rain seemed to quiet, as if the sky itself were listening. Marcus felt every eye on him, waiting to see if greed would overcome the collective wisdom of people who'd lived in these mountains their entire lives. He thought about his dwindling savings account, about the cramped studio apartment he rented, month to month in Billings, about the job interviews that led nowhere, and the credit card bills that kept growing. $7 for nearly 4 square miles of Montana ranch land was either the opportunity of a lifetime or the mistake that would define whatever years he had left. $7, he said, raising his hand again. The auctioneer's gavel came, down with a sound like breaking bone. "Sold to bidder 73. The crowd dispersed quickly after that, people hurrying to their cars, as if afraid that proximity to the new owner of the Blackwood Ranch might somehow contaminate them. Marcus stood alone on the courthouse steps, rain soaking through his jacket, holding a piece of paper that legally made him the owner of a property most of the county considered uninhabitable. The drive to the ranch took 47 minutes along increasingly deteriorated roads. The final 8 miles were nothing more than twin-tire tracks through tall grass, with occasional wooden posts marking the boundaries of his new property. The landscape was beautiful in the way that only Montana could be. Rolling hills covered, in autumn gold grass, stands of aspen trees showing their first hints of winter bronze, and the distant peaks of the Absaroka Range cutting sharp lines against a grey sky. But as Marcus drove deeper into the property, he noticed things that didn't fit the postcard beauty. Fence posts that had been deliberately cut rather than naturally. Broken. Gates that hung open, their chains cut cleanly through with bolt cutters. Most tellingly, tire tracks that led right up to the main road and then stopped, as if vehicles had backed all the way out rather than risk turning around on the property. The main house appeared as he crested a low hill, and Marcus had to admit it looked exactly like what most people would call haunted. 3 stories of weathered Victorian architecture, with a wraparound porch that sagged in places and shutters that hung at odd angles. The peaked roof was missing several shingles, and one of the chimneys had partially collapsed. Paint peeled from the siding like old skin, and several windows were boarded over with plywood that had warped and split. But Marcus had renovated enough old houses to see past the cosmetic decay. The structure looked sound. The foundation was stone and appeared solid. The roof had problems, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. Most importantly, the bones of the house were good. High ceilings, large rooms, quality materials that had lasted over a century. He parked near the front porch and sat in his truck for a moment, studying the property. The barn was in worse shape than the house, its red paint faded to rust brown, but it too looked structurally sound. Several smaller outbuildings dotted the landscape, what might have been a smokehouse, a tool shed, and something that looked like old servants' quarters. The silence was complete. No birds, no wind through the grass, no distant highway noise. Just the ticking of his truck's cooling engine and his own breathing. Marcus had spent enough time in rural Montana to know that this kind of absolute quiet wasn't normal. Even in The most remote areas, there were always sounds, insects, small animals, the whisper of wind through vegetation. He stepped out of the truck and immediately felt the temperature difference. It had to be at least 10 degrees colder here than it had been at the courthouse, and the air carried a smell he couldn't identify. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The front porch groaned under his weight. As he approached the door, someone had secured it with a heavy chain and padlock, but both looked recently installed. Marcus pulled out his phone to call a locksmith, then remembered he was probably 40 miles from the nearest cell tower. The isolation he'd seen as an advantage suddenly felt more ominous. He walked around the house, looking for another way in, and that's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on wood. It seemed to come from inside the house, moving from room to room with deliberate purpose. Marcus pressed his ear to the nearest window, and the tapping stopped instantly, as if whatever was making the sound knew it was being listened to. He stepped back, heart beating faster than the cold alone could account for. The rational part of his mind offered explanations, settling wood, small animals, pipes expanding and contracting. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive on dark nights for thousands of generations, was screaming at him to get back in his truck and drive away. Instead, Marcus walked to the barn. The big sliding door was partially open, hanging crooked on rails that had shifted with age. He pulled it wider, wincing as it scraped against the track. With a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, afternoon light slanted through gaps in the roof, illuminating a space that was larger than his entire apartment. Old farming equipment sat covered in tarps that had become nearly transparent with age and weather. A rusted tractor, its tires flat and cracked, plows and cultivators arranged against the walls like sleeping dinosaurs. The air smelled of motor oil, hay dust, and something else, something that reminded Marcus of his grandmother's root cellar, earthy and dark and alive. He was examining what looked like an antique threshing machine when he heard the voices, children's voices, high and clear, coming from somewhere deeper in the barn. They were singing something, a lullaby maybe, or a nursery rhyme. The melody was familiar, but Marcus couldn't place it. What he could place was the impossibility of children being here, on a property that had been abandoned for over a year, 40 miles from the nearest town. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps moving across the loft. Above his head, not the scampering of small animals or the settling of old wood, but the deliberate footfalls of multiple people trying to move quietly. Marcus looked up at the loft, accessible by a ladder built into the barn wall. Every instinct told him to leave, to get in his truck and drive back to Billings and forget he'd ever heard of the Blackwood Ranch. But $7 was $7, and he'd invested too much of his remaining hope in this place to walk away. Based on sounds that probably had rational explanations, he climbed the ladder. The loft was a single large space under the peaked roof, illuminated by shafts of light from gaps between the boards. Hay bales were stacked along one wall, and the floor was covered with loose straw that rustled under his feet. But what stopped Marcus cold were the signs that someone had been living here. Blankets arranged in neat sleeping areas, a small camping stove with pots and utensils organized nearby, clothes hanging from nails driven into the support beams, children's clothes in various sizes. A makeshift table constructed from a piece of plywood and 2 sawhorses, with books and papers scattered across its surface. And in the far corner, pressed against the wall like animals trying to hide, were 9 people. A woman, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been running on determination alone for too long. She had one arm around a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, and the other around a boy, maybe 6 or 7. Behind her, 6 more children ranging in age, from what looked like 8 to perhaps 16, all pressed together in a protective huddle. They stared at each other across the loft floor, Marcus and this unexpected family, the silence stretching, until it became almost unbearable. The woman's eyes never left his face, and he could see her calculating distance to the ladder, whether she could get all the children down and away before he could stop them, where they would run in a landscape that offered no shelter for 40 miles in any direction. "Please," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "please don't hurt us." Marcus raised his hands slowly, the way he'd learned to approach skittish horses. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I bought this place today. At auction. I didn't know anyone was here." The woman's grip on the youngest children tightened. "You bought it? For $7. The county was selling it for back taxes." He paused, studying her face. Were you hiding from the other people who tried to buy this place?" Something shifted in her expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition of an opportunity. "The ones who left at night. We made sure they left." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the barn walls. "Made sure how?" The oldest of the children, a boy who looked about 16, stepped forward slightly. His shoulders were squared with the kind of premature responsibility that came from being the man of a family too young. Lights in the windows, sounds at night, things moving that shouldn't move. "You've been scaring people away?" The woman spoke. Again, her voice stronger now. "This place has been our home for 8 months. When someone comes looking to take it away," she gestured toward her children, "we do what we have to do." Marcus looked at the faces arranged behind her. 8 children, ranging from the tiny girl clutched in her mother's arms to the teenager who was trying to position himself as protector. They were clean and appeared well fed, but their clothes were worn and carefully mended. Their eyes held the particular alertness of people who'd learned to be ready for anything. "What are your names?" Marcus asked. The woman hesitated for a long moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. These are my children." She pointed to each child as she spoke their names. "David, he's 16. Emma, she's 14. The twins are Michael and Matthew, they're 12, Rebecca is 10, Joshua is 8, little Mary is 6, and this is Grace." The 4-year-old in her arms buried her face against her mother's shoulder. 8 children, Marcus said, and immediately regretted how that sounded. Sarah's chin lifted defiantly. "Yes, 8 children, and before you ask, they're all mine. They're all healthy, and they're all staying with me." I wasn't going to ask that. Marcus sat down slowly on a hay bale, trying to make himself less threatening. "I was going to ask how you ended up living in my barn." "Your barn," Sarah repeated, and he heard the bitterness in her voice. "Right, your $7 barn." The story came out in pieces over the next hour, as the children gradually relaxed enough to sit down, and Sarah decided that Marcus posed less immediate threat than the alternatives they'd been facing. Sarah Mitchell had been married to a man named Robert, who'd worked in the coal mines near Red Lodge. When the mine closed, he'd found work on an oil rig in North Dakota, driving home on weekends to see his family. The accident happened on a Friday night in January. Black ice and a semi-truck carrying agricultural equipment. Robert was killed instantly, along with 2 other men from their town. The life insurance was enough to cover the funeral and pay off their trailer, but not much more. Sarah had worked in part-time as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, but with 8 children at home, full-time work was impossible. "The state wanted to split them up," Sarah said, her arm still around little Grace. "Social services said no single mother could adequately care for 8 children. They had foster homes lined up, different homes, different towns. They were going to scatter my babies across 3 counties. Instead, Sarah had loaded her children and everything they could carry into a 15-year-old van and driven away. In the middle of a February night, They'd stayed in campgrounds and cheap motels for weeks, moving constantly to avoid being tracked. Sarah paid for everything in cash, used fake names, and kept the children out of school to prevent anyone from asking questions. "We heard about this place from some people at a truck stop in Livingston," David, the 16-year-old, explained. "They said it was haunted, that nobody would come here. So we came here," Emma, the 14-year-old girl, continued. "It was perfect. Nobody bothered us, and there was shelter and water from the well. But people kept trying to buy it," one of the 12-year-old twins added. "So we had to make them think it really was haunted." Marcus looked around the loft again, seeing it differently now. Not just a place where desperate people had taken shelter, but a home carefully constructed from necessity and love. The children's clothes weren't just hanging to dry, they were organized by size and season. The camping stove wasn't just for heating food, it was surrounded by the careful arrangements of a functional kitchen. The books scattered on the makeshift table weren't random, they were textbooks, because Sarah was homeschooling 8 children, while hiding from the state agencies that wanted to separate them. "How long did you think you could stay here?" Marcus asked. Sarah's jaw tightened. "As long as we needed to. As long as it took." "Took for what?" "For them to get old enough," she said simply. "David turns 18 in 14 months, Emma in 3 years after that. Once they're adults, the state can't split us up anymore." Marcus did the math. Sarah was planning to hide in this barn with 8 children for potentially decades, keeping them fed and educated and healthy while making sure no one discovered their existence. It was simultaneously the most impractical and most devoted thing he'd ever heard. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "I think we need to talk about what happens next." The fear returned to her eyes immediately. The children sensed the change in atmosphere and pressed closer to their mother. David's hand moved to something tucked in his waistband, a knife, Marcus realized, or maybe a gun. "You can't turn us in," Sarah said, and her voice carried the edge of someone who'd been pushed past their breaking point. "I won't let you split up my family. I'm not going to turn you in," Marcus said. "But we need to figure out how this is going to work, because I own this property now, and you're living on it." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken possibilities. Marcus could call the authorities, have them removed, and pursue his original plan of renovating and selling. The ranch. Sarah could take her children and run again, disappearing into the vast anonymity of rural America. Or they could find some third option, some arrangement that served everyone's needs. Marcus looked at the children's faces, saw the exhaustion beneath their alertness, the way they unconsciously arranged themselves in protective formations around the younger ones. He thought about his empty apartment in Billings, about the job interviews that went nowhere, about the particular loneliness of a man approaching middle age with no family and no clear purpose. "How much do you know about ranch work?" he asked Sarah. The question caught her off guard. "Some. I grew up on a farm outside of Columbus. My daddy raised cattle and horses." "Can you cook for a crew?" "I've been cooking for 9 people on a camping stove for 8 months. I think I can manage." Marcus nodded slowly, an idea forming. "And your kids, they're strong enough for ranch work?" David straightened, recognizing an opportunity when he heard one. "Yes, sir. We've been maintaining this place while we've been here, fixing what we could, keeping the buildings from falling apart." "The well pump needed new seals," one of the twins added. "We fixed it ourselves." "And we've been keeping the fences mended where the cattle get through," Emma said. Marcus looked around the loft one more time, seeing it now not as a hiding place, but as evidence of remarkable resourcefulness. These people had created a functioning household from nothing, had maintained a property that others had abandoned, had survived 8 months on determination and ingenuity. "Here's what I'm thinking," Marcus said finally. "I need help getting this ranch operational again. You need a place to stay, where no one will ask questions. Maybe we can work something out." Sarah's eyes narrowed. What kind of work? Partnership, Marcus said. You help me fix up this place, get it running as a working ranch again, and in exchange, you and your kids have a permanent home. Legal residence, your own space in the main house, regular income. No more hiding, no more running. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, hopeful rather than fearful. The children looked at their mother with expressions that mixed excitement with disbelief. "Why would you do that?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus thought about the question for a long moment. Why would he offer to share his $7 ranch with a woman and 8 children he'd met less than 2 hours ago? The practical reasons were easy enough to list. The property was too large for one person to manage. He needed help with renovations. Having residents would establish the ranch as occupied and inhabited. But the real reason was harder to articulate. Maybe it was the way the children had arranged themselves protectively around their mother. Maybe it was the recognition of someone who'd risked everything for family. Maybe it was simply that he'd spent too many years alone, and the sound of children's laughter in an empty barn had reminded him what he'd been missing. "Because," Marcus said finally, "some hauntings aren't supernatural. Some are just people who need a home." As the afternoon light faded and the October air grew colder, Marcus Thompson and Sarah Mitchell began to plan how 9 fugitives and 1 lonely rancher might build something neither of them had ever expected to find, a family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning arrived with frost covering the barn roof and Marcus's breath visible in the October air. He'd spent the night in his truck, having given Sarah and her children time to discuss his proposal privately. Through the barn walls, he'd heard their voices late into the evening, sometimes heated, sometimes whispered, always careful not to wake the youngest ones. Now, as he approached the barn with a bag of groceries from the general store in Millfield, he could smell coffee brewing and hear the organized chaos of a large family beginning their day. The sliding door was open, just enough for him to see inside without intruding. Sarah stood at their makeshift kitchen area, efficiently managing breakfast for 9 people on a 2-burner camping stove. The older children moved with practiced coordination, David pumping water from a container into a washing basin, Emma braiding little Mary's hair while simultaneously helping Grace button her sweater, the twins organizing schoolbooks on their plywood table. It was Joshua, the 8-year-old, who spotted Marcus first. "Mom!" he called out, his voice carrying the particular alertness of a child who'd learned to be watchful. "He's back." The family activity paused as they all turned toward the entrance. Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel, her expression carefully neutral. She'd obviously made some decision during the night, but Marcus couldn't read what it was from her face. "Mr. Thompson," she said formally, "we've discussed your offer." Marcus stepped into the barn, setting the grocery bag on a hay bale. And David, the 16-year-old, stepped forward. Despite his age, he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd been making adult decisions for months. "We have questions." "Fair enough." "First question," David continued. "What happens when the state comes looking for us? Because they will eventually." Marcus had anticipated this. He'd spent much of his sleepless night researching Montana family law on his phone during the brief periods when he could get a signal. If you're working as ranch employees, living in employee housing, with your children enrolled in the local school district, it becomes much harder for social services to argue that you're unfit or unstable. Emma, the 14-year-old, spoke up, "But they could still take us away." "They could try," Marcus acknowledged, "but they'd have to prove that you're being harmed or neglected. If you're healthy, educated, and living in a stable environment with adequate supervision and resources, their case becomes a lot weaker." Sarah crossed her arms. "And what do you get out of this arrangement? Because I don't believe in charity, and I won't put my children in debt to anyone." I get help renovating this place, Marcus said simply. I get people who know how to maintain ranch equipment and manage livestock. He paused, looking at the organized efficiency of their morning routine. I get a family that can turn a $7 piece of abandoned property into something valuable. 10-year-old Rebecca, who had been quietly listening, suddenly asked, "Do you have any kids of your own, Mr. Thompson?" The question hit unexpectedly. Marcus felt the attention of all 9 people focused on him, waiting for an answer that would tell them something essential about his character. "No," he said, quietly. "I was married once, but we couldn't have children. She left about 5 years ago." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people reassessing their assumptions. Sarah's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Second question," David continued, but his tone had lost some of its formality. "The house, is it actually livable?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed them the photos he'd taken the previous evening while they talked. "The structure is sound, the electrical needs work, and there's no running water upstairs, but the bones are good. With some effort, it could house a large family comfortably." He swiped through images of rooms with high ceilings and large windows, hardwood floors beneath layers of dust, fireplaces that just needed cleaning, a kitchen that was outdated but functional. "The real question," Marcus continued, "is whether you're willing to work for it. This won't be easy. The house needs extensive renovation, the outbuildings need repair, and if we're going to make this a working ranch again, we'll need to invest in livestock and equipment." Matthew, one of the 12-year-old twins, looked up from the school book he'd been pretending to read. "How much work are we talking about?" Marcus gestured toward the house visible through the barn opening. 6 months to make it properly livable, a year to make it comfortable, 2 years to make it profitable. "And during that time," Sarah asked, "during that time, you and your children have legal residence, regular income based on the work you contribute, and most importantly, no one looking over your shoulders or threatening to separate your family." Sarah walked to the barn opening and stared out at the house, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. Marcus could see her calculating, not just the practical considerations, but the emotional cost of trusting someone new with her children's futures. "There's something else," she said without turning around, "something you need to know about why we're really here." The children exchanged glances, and Marcus sensed that they were approaching territory that had been carefully guarded. "The social services issue isn't the whole story," Sarah continued, finally turning back to face him. "There's more." David stepped closer to his mother, and Marcus noticed that his hand again moved toward whatever he kept hidden in his waistband. "Maybe we shouldn't." "He deserves to know," Sarah interrupted. "If he's going to be part of this, he needs to understand what he's getting into." She sat down on a hay bale, and the children gradually arranged themselves around her in their familiar protective formation. Grace, the 4-year-old, climbed into her lap. "My husband Robert didn't just die in a car accident," Sarah began. "He was killed because he found out something he wasn't supposed to know." Marcus felt the temperature in the barn seemed to drop another few degrees. The oil rig where he worked, it was owned by a company called Hartwell Industries. Sarah's voice grew quiet, and Marcus had to strain to hear her. Robert was a shift supervisor, which meant he had access to safety reports and environmental monitoring data. "Mom," Emma said quietly, "are you sure?" "He's going to find out eventually anyway," Sarah replied, "especially if he's serious about this partnership." She looked directly at Marcus. "Robert discovered that the company was falsifying safety reports and dumping toxic wastewater into the groundwater system. He copied the documents and took them to the EPA and the State Environmental Office." Marcus began to understand why the family had been so careful about staying hidden. 2 weeks before he died, Robert started getting threatening phone calls. "Someone broke into our trailer and went through his papers." His supervisor at work told him he was being transferred to a rig in Alaska, effective immediately. That's when Daddy started keeping copies of everything at our house, 6-year-old Mary added quietly, hidden in places where bad people wouldn't look. Sarah nodded. The night he died, Robert was driving home with another copy of the documents. He was supposed to meet with a federal investigator the next morning. The accident wasn't an accident, David said bluntly. The police report said it was black ice, but there hadn't been precipitation in 3 days. The road was dry. Marcus sat down heavily on a nearby hay bale. And you think the company had him killed? I don't think it, Sarah said. I know it. Because 3 days after the funeral, 2 men in expensive suits showed up at our trailer asking about Robert's personal papers. They said they were from the company's insurance department, but they weren't interested in insurance forms. They wanted the environmental reports, Emma explained, the ones that proved the company was poisoning people's water. When I told them I didn't know anything about any papers, they said it would be unfortunate if something happened to me or my children, Sarah continued. They suggested that maybe the state would be better at protecting my kids if they were in separate foster homes. The pieces clicked into place for Marcus. So, you ran not just because of social services, but because someone was threatening your family? The social services case was real, Sarah clarified, but it was also convenient for people who wanted us to disappear. If the state split up my children and scattered them across different counties, no one would ever think to ask what happened to Robert Mitchell's missing documents. Where are the documents now? Marcus asked. Sarah looked at David, who nodded once. The teenager reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila envelope sealed with tape and plastic wrap. We've kept them with us everywhere we've gone, Sarah said, because they're our insurance policy. As long as we have proof of what Robert discovered, we're more valuable alive than dead. Marcus stared at the envelope, understanding now why this family had been able to successfully hide for 8 months. They weren't just running from poverty or bureaucratic complications. They were running from people with the resources and motivation to make problems permanently disappear. Who else knows about this? He asked. Just us, Sarah said, and now you. The weight of that trust settled over Marcus like a heavy coat. These people had just shared information that could get them all killed, and they'd done it because they believed he deserved to know what he was walking into. The question now, David said, his voice steady despite his age, is whether you still want to be partners with a family that's being hunted by people who kill oil rig supervisors and make it look like accidents. Marcus looked around the barn at 9 people who had rebuilt their lives from nothing, while carrying secrets that could topple a major corporation. Children who had learned to create ghost stories convincing enough to scare away adults. A mother who had chosen to live in hiding rather than let bureaucrats destroy her family. How long do you think you can keep running? He asked. As long as we have to, Sarah replied without hesitation. And how long do you think it'll be before someone with real resources starts putting pieces together? Before they figure out that the haunted ranch that nobody wants to buy is the perfect place for a family to disappear? The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. Here's what I think, Marcus said finally. I think you're safer hiding in plain sight than you are hiding in the shadows. I think a family of ranch employees living in employee housing is a lot less interesting to dangerous people than a family of mysterious fugitives living in abandoned barns. And if you're wrong, Emma asked quietly. Marcus met her eyes, seeing intelligence and fear in equal measure. Then we make sure we're prepared for whatever comes. He stood up and walked to the barn opening, looking out at the house that would either become their sanctuary or their trap. But I want to be clear about something, he said, turning back to face them. If we're going to be partners, real partners, then we're all in this together. Your problems become my problems and my problems become yours. That envelope stays hidden until we're strong enough and established enough to use it safely. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then looked at each of her children in turn. Marcus could see the silent communication that passed between them, the kind of wordless consultation that came from months of depending entirely on each other. "All right," she said finally. "We're willing to try this partnership, but we do it our way, carefully, quietly, and with everyone's safety as the first priority." "Agreed," Marcus said, as the morning sun climbed higher, warming the frost on the barn roof. The unlikely family began to plan their next steps. Marcus would return to town to purchase supplies and establish legal employment paperwork. Sarah and the older children would begin assessing what the house needed to become livable. The younger children would continue their homeschool routine, while helping with age-appropriate tasks. But underneath the practical planning, they all understood that they were crossing a line. Marcus was no longer just a man who'd bought a cheap ranch. Sarah and her children were no longer just refugees hiding from an unjust system. They were now conspirators in something much larger and more dangerous. As Marcus prepared to drive back to Millfield for supplies, 8-year-old Joshua tugged on his jacket. "Mr. Thompson," the boy said, "are you going to be our dad now?" The question caught Marcus off guard, and he saw Sarah's eyes widen with alarm at her son's directness. "I'm going to be your friend," Marcus said carefully, "and your partner. And I'm going to help make sure you and your family are safe." Joshua considered this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "That sounds like what dads do." As Marcus drove away from the ranch, he caught a glimpse in his rear-view mirror of the family standing together in the barn opening, watching him leave. For the first time in years, he was driving towards something rather than just away from his problems, but he also understood with crystalline clarity that he was no longer making decisions just for himself. 8 children and their mother were now depending on him to be smart, careful, and strong enough to protect them from dangers that were still largely unknown. The $7 ranch had just become the most expensive investment of his life. 3 weeks into their partnership, the Blackwood Ranch was beginning to show signs of life that had nothing to do with supernatural hauntings. Marcus stood in what would soon be the main kitchen, watching Sarah direct a renovation project with the efficiency of a military commander and the patience of a teacher managing 8 very different personalities. "David, those floorboards in the pantry are rotted through," she called to her oldest son, who was working in the adjoining room. "We'll need to replace at least 6 planks before we can put any weight on them." "Already pulled them up, Mom," David's voice echoed back. "Mr. Thompson brought the replacement lumber yesterday." Marcus had discovered that David possessed an intuitive understanding of construction that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Give him a problem involving wood, nails, and basic physics, and he'd find a solution that was both elegant and practical. More importantly, he worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that their family's future depended on getting things right. Emma, meanwhile, had revealed herself to be a natural project manager. She kept detailed lists of what needed to be done, what supplies were required, and which children were best suited for which tasks. At 14, she coordinated the daily work schedule with more competence than most adults Marcus had worked with. "The twins finished cleaning out the upstairs bedrooms," Emma reported, consulting the clipboard that had become permanently attached to her hands. "Rebecca and Joshua got all the broken plaster bagged up. Mary's been helping Mom with organizing the kitchen supplies." "And Grace?" Marcus asked, looking around for the 4-year-old who had a talent for disappearing whenever work was being assigned. "Napping in the truck," Emma said with a slight smile. "She worked really hard this morning carrying scraps to the burn pile." The past 3 weeks had established a rhythm that surprised Marcus with its naturalness. Every morning, Sarah would assign age-appropriate tasks while maintaining the children's educational schedule. The older kids worked on major renovation projects. The middle children handled cleaning and organizing, and the younger ones helped with simple jobs that made them feel included while keeping them safely occupied. Marcus had initially worried about child labor laws and safety issues, but he quickly realized that Sarah had been managing this balance for months. Her children weren't being exploited. They were being taught skills, responsibility, and the satisfaction that came from contributing to something larger than themselves. Mr. Thompson, 10-year-old Rebecca called from the living room. "Can you come look at this?" Marcus found Rebecca standing in front of the large stone fireplace, pointing at something carved into the mantelpiece. "I was cleaning off all the dust and found this." The carving was small and easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it. A set of initials followed by a date. WB 1923 was etched into the wood with careful precision. "William Blackwood," Marcus said. "The man who used to own this place." "The one who disappeared?" Rebecca asked. "That's right." Rebecca traced the letters with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he was happy here?" It was an unexpectedly profound question from a 10-year-old. Marcus looked around the room, seeing it through Rebecca's eyes. High ceilings, tall windows that let in streams of afternoon light, built-in bookcases, that spoke of someone who valued reading and learning. Despite the years of neglect, the room had good bones and a warmth that no amount of dust could completely obscure. "I think he might have been," Marcus said. "For a while, anyway." That evening, as had become their custom, the family gathered in the main living room after dinner. Sarah had managed to get the old radio working, and they listened to country music from a station in Billings while working on various projects. The older children did homework, Sarah mended clothes, and Marcus reviewed ranch supply catalogs. But tonight felt different. Grace had fallen asleep in Marcus's lap while he read to her, and he found himself reluctant to wake her up. Sarah noticed his discomfort and smiled. "She's gotten attached to you," Sarah observed quietly. "Kids do that," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. In the 3 weeks since he'd met the Mitchell family, Grace had begun following him around whenever he was working near the house. She'd appointed herself his official tool holder, water fetcher, and conversation partner. "She doesn't remember her father very well," Sarah continued, her voice carefully neutral. "She was only 2 when Robert died." Marcus felt the weight of that information settle heavily in his chest. He looked down at Grace's sleeping face, relaxed and trusting in a way that spoke of a child who felt genuinely safe. "The others remember him," Sarah added. "David, especially. He and Robert used to work on projects together, fixing engines, building things. David learned most of what he knows about construction from his father." "He's a good kid," Marcus said. "They all are." "They've had to be," Sarah replied, and there was no self-pity in her voice, just acknowledgement of reality. When you're responsible for keeping your family together, you grow up fast. The next morning brought their first real test of how well their new arrangement would work under pressure. Marcus was in the barn working on the old tractor when he heard David shouting from the direction of the house. "Mom, Mr. Thompson, car coming up the road." Marcus dropped his wrench and ran toward the house, where he found the family gathered. At the living room windows, a black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up the dirt road, moving slowly and deliberately. "Everyone upstairs," Sarah ordered quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd practiced this scenario. "Now!" The children moved with practiced efficiency, gathering up any signs of their presence and disappearing up the staircase. Within 30 seconds, the house looked like it contained only 2 adults. Marcus positioned himself at the front window, where he could see the approaching vehicle. "You recognize the car?" "No," Sarah said, but her voice was tight with tension. "But that doesn't mean anything. They could have sent different people." The SUV pulled up near the front porch and sat there for a long moment, engine running. Marcus could see two figures in the front seats, but the tinted windows made it impossible to identify them. Finally, both doors opened and two men stepped out. They were dressed in business casual clothing that was just expensive enough to suggest. They weren't local, but not so formal as to scream federal agents. One was tall and thin, with graying hair. The other shorter and stockier, with the kind of tan that came from spending time outdoors. Marcus opened the front door before they could knock, positioning himself in the doorway in a way that blocked. "Their view into the house help you, gentlemen?" he asked. The taller man stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Jim Bradley from Western Land Development. This is my associate Pete Carlson. We understand you recently acquired this property." "That's right," Marcus said carefully. "We represent some investors who are very interested in this area," Bradley continued. "Beautiful country out here, perfect for certain types of development projects." "What kind of development?" Carlson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place. "Energy projects primarily, wind farms, solar installations, that sort of thing. This property has excellent exposure and road access." Marcus felt Sarah's presence behind him, though she stayed out of sight. "I'm not interested in selling," he said flatly. Bradley's smile widened. "Oh, we're not necessarily talking about selling. There are partnership arrangements, leasing agreements, all sorts of creative options that could be very profitable for everyone involved." "Still not interested." "Well," Bradley said, his tone becoming slightly less friendly, "perhaps you haven't had time to fully consider your options. This is a big property for one person to manage effectively. Expensive to maintain, especially if you're planning any major renovations." The comment was too specific to be coincidental. These men had been watching the ranch, had seen the renovation. Supplies being delivered had probably been monitoring Marcus's trips to town. "I manage just fine," Marcus replied. Carlson stepped closer, his movement casual but somehow threatening. "Mr. Thompson, we've done our research on you. Laid off from the refinery, limited savings, no significant property holdings until now. A partnership with the right investors could solve a lot of problems for you. What if I said I already have partners?" The two men exchanged a quick glance, and Marcus saw something shift in their expressions. "Partners?" Bradley asked. "Local? A family. They're helping with the renovation work in exchange for residence and a share of any future profits." It wasn't entirely a lie, but Marcus hoped it would serve as a warning that the property wasn't as isolated as it appeared. "Interesting," Carlson said. "We weren't aware you had brought in additional residents." "Not much reason you would be," Marcus replied evenly. Bradley pulled out a business card and held it toward Marcus. "Well, Mr. Thompson, we'd still like you to consider our offer. Perhaps when you've had time to discuss it with your partners." Marcus took the card without looking at it. "I'll do that. We'll be in touch," Bradley said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't a casual promise. The two men returned to their SUV and drove away, but Marcus noticed they took their time, clearly examining the property and outbuildings as they left. When their car disappeared over the ridge, Sarah emerged from the house. "Energy Development Company?" she asked. "Maybe," Marcus said, studying the business card. "Or maybe people who heard that someone bought the haunted ranch and want to know who's crazy enough to live here. Or maybe," Sarah said quietly, "people who are wondering why a family that was supposed to disappear 8 months ago might be hiding on a piece of property that just changed hands." That evening, Marcus drove to Millfield to use the internet connection at the public library. He researched Western Land Development and found a professional-looking website with projects listed across several western states. The company appeared legitimate, but something about the afternoon's visit felt wrong. When he returned to the ranch, he found Sarah waiting for him in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. "I've been thinking about those men," she said without preamble. "And the timing is too convenient. We've been here 8 months without anyone showing real interest in this property. You buy it, we start renovating, and suddenly development companies are showing up with partnership offers." Marcus sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "You think they're connected to your husband's situation?" "I think," Sarah said, carefully, "that we need to be very careful about who we trust and what information we share." From upstairs came the sound of the children getting ready for bed, water running, voices calling back and forth, the comfortable chaos of a large family settling in for the night. It struck Marcus that in just 3 weeks, these sounds had become as familiar to him as his own breathing. "Sarah," he said, "there's something I need to ask you." She waited. "Are you planning to use those documents your husband left? Eventually, I mean." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "I don't know," she said finally. "Part of me wants to see justice done for Robert, but another part of me knows that going public would put my children in danger. What if there was a way to do both, to get justice and keep your family safe?" "How?" Marcus leaned forward. "What if we made ourselves too visible to disappear? What if we became so obviously legitimate, so clearly established in this community, that making us vanish would raise too many questions?" Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Marcus said, "that we need to become the most successful, most visible ranch operation in this county. We need to be involved in community events, school activities, local business associations. We need to make sure that half the county knows the Mitchell family and considers them neighbors." "Hide in plain sight," Sarah murmured. "Exactly. And once we're established, once we have community connections and local support, then maybe we consider what to do with your husband's evidence." Sarah nodded slowly. "It's risky, but you might be right that it's less risky than staying hidden." As they discussed the details of integrating the family into the local community, Marcus felt a shift in their relationship. They were no longer just partners in a business arrangement. They were co-conspirators in a plan that could either save Sarah's family or get them all killed. But as he listened to the children settling into sleep in the rooms above them, Marcus realized he was willing to take that risk. Somewhere over the past 3 weeks, 8 children and their mother had stopped being his responsibility and started being his family. The only question now was whether their enemies would give them enough time to build the defenses they needed. Millfield Elementary School gymnasium buzzed with the controlled chaos of a community potluck dinner. Marcus stood near the entrance, adjusting his tie nervously while watching Sarah smooth down Grace's hair for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The Mitchell children clustered around their mother, dressed in their best clothes, which Marcus had learned meant carefully mended hand-me-downs that Sarah had somehow made look respectable. "Remember," Sarah whispered to her older children, "we're the new ranch hands at the Blackwood place. Mr. Thompson hired us to help with renovations and livestock management. We've been here about a month." David nodded, his jaw set with determination. At 16, he understood better than his younger siblings how critical this evening was to their family's future safety. Emma clutched a covered dish containing her specialty, cornbread made from a recipe that had belonged to her grandmother, and tried to look confident despite the butterflies Marcus could see fluttering in her expression. "They're going to ask questions," Marcus said quietly. "Lots of questions. That's normal for a small community when new people arrive." "What if they ask about Dad?" 8-year-old Joshua whispered, unconsciously moving closer to his mother. Sarah knelt down to his eye level. "Then you tell them the truth, that your daddy died in an accident, and now Mr. Thompson is helping us have a new start. That's all anyone needs to know." Marcus surveyed the room, mentally cataloguing the faces he recognized from his trips to town. There was Mrs. Henderson from the general store, talking animatedly with a group of women near the dessert table. Sheriff Ray Coleman stood by the coffee station, his posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly scanning the room with professional awareness. The bank president, a thin man named Arthur Caldwell, held court near the basketball hoop, surrounded by what appeared to be the town's business leaders. "Ready?" Marcus asked. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." Their entrance didn't go unnoticed. As they made their way across the gymnasium floor, conversations paused and heads turned. Marcus could feel the weight of curious stares and hear the subtle shift in the room's energy that came when a small community encountered something new and potentially interesting. Mrs. Henderson approached them first, her expression warm but evaluating. "Marcus Thompson, how nice to see you here, and you must be the family he's been telling us about." "Sarah Mitchell," Sarah said, extending her hand with a confidence that Marcus knew cost her considerable effort. "And these are my children." The introductions proceeded smoothly, each child stepping forward to shake hands and offer polite greetings that demonstrated the careful coaching Sarah had provided. Marcus watched the faces of the townspeople as they met the Mitchell family, seeing initial curiosity give way to something warmer as the children's genuine politeness and good manners made their impression. 8 children, Mrs. Henderson mused, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of someone who'd raised 4 of her own. That's quite a household to manage. "They're good kids," Sarah replied simply. "They help each other, and they help me." "And you're helping Marcus fix up the old Blackwood place?" This question came from a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Tom Garrett, owner of the local hardware store. "That's right," Sarah said. "The children and I have experience with ranch work and renovation projects. It's been a good arrangement for everyone." Sheriff Coleman materialized at Marcus's elbow with the silent movement of someone accustomed to observing before being observed. "Marcus," he said, his tone friendly, but carrying undertones of professional interest. "Settling in well out at the ranch?" "Very well, thank you, Sheriff. No more problems with trespassers or vandalism?" Marcus felt Sarah tense slightly beside him. They discussed how to handle questions about the ranch's haunted reputation, but facing them in real time felt more challenging than they'd anticipated. "Nothing we couldn't handle," Marcus replied carefully. Place had been empty for a while, so there were some minor issues with people thinking it was abandoned, but having residents there full-time has solved most of the problems. "Good to hear," Coleman said, though his eyes lingered on the Mitchell children with the particular attention of a law enforcement officer who made it his business to know every family in his jurisdiction. "Kids, you'll be starting school here." "In Millfield?" Emma stepped forward slightly, recognizing her cue. "Yes, sir. Mom's been homeschooling us while we traveled, but we're looking forward to joining classes here." "Homeschooling, huh?" Coleman's expression remained neutral, but Marcus detected increased interest. "What brings a family like yours to Montana?" Sarah's response came smoothly, with just the right note of weariness. "After my husband died, we needed a fresh start. When Mr. Thompson offered us work and housing, it seemed like the right opportunity to settle down somewhere stable." "Sorry for your loss," Coleman said, and his sympathy sounded genuine. "What kind of work was your husband in?" "Mining," Sarah replied, which was technically true. "Industrial accident." Coleman nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, welcome to Millfield. It's a good place to raise children." As the sheriff moved away, Marcus noticed that their conversation had been overheard by several other adults, who were now approaching with the kind of determined friendliness that he recognized as small-town information gathering. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions, questions, and careful answers. The Mitchell children handled themselves beautifully, charming adults with their politeness and making tentative connections with other children their ages. Grace, in particular, won hearts by shyly offering to share her mother's cornbread with Anyone who looked hungry. Marcus found himself in conversation with Arthur Caldwell, the bank president, who seemed particularly interested in the ranch's financial prospects. "That's a sizable piece of property you've acquired," Caldwell observed, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "Big investment for a single man." "That's why I brought in partners," Marcus replied, gesturing towards Sarah, who was helping Rebecca navigate. "The dessert table. The Mitchell family brings experience and workforce that I couldn't afford to hire otherwise." "Smart thinking," Caldwell agreed. "What are your long-term plans for the operation?" "Cattle initially, maybe some horses eventually. The land can support a decent herd, and there's good water access. Sarah has experience with livestock management, and her older children are natural ranch hands." "Interesting." Caldwell's expression suggested he was performing mental calculations. "You'll need capital for livestock acquisition, equipment, feed, supplies. Have you given thought to financing options?" Marcus had indeed given considerable thought to these issues, particularly since he was operating on limited funds and needed to generate income quickly to support 9 people. "We're planning to start small and build gradually," he said. "Bootstrap operation initially, then expand as cash flow allows." "Prudent approach," Caldwell said, though his tone suggested he might have other ideas. "When you're ready to discuss expansion financing, the bank would be interested in talking." As the evening progressed, Marcus began to sense that their strategy of hiding in plain sight might actually work. The townspeople seemed to accept the Mitchell family as simply another ranch family trying to make a living in tough economic times. Their story of a widowed mother finding work and housing with a bachelor rancher was neither unusual enough to generate suspicion nor interesting enough to inspire excessive curiosity. But as they prepared to leave, Marcus noticed a conversation taking place near the gymnasium's back exit that made him uneasy. 2 men he didn't recognize were talking quietly with Sheriff Coleman, and all 3 were looking in the direction of the Mitchell family. One of the strangers was tall and thin with graying hair, Jim Bradley from Western Land Development, the man who'd visited the ranch the previous week. Marcus caught Sarah's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the group by the exit. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her subtly position herself closer to her younger children. "Time to head home," Marcus announced casually. "Early morning tomorrow." The family began their polite rounds of goodbyes, thanking hosts and promising to see new acquaintances at church on Sunday. But Marcus kept one eye on the conversation by the exit, noting that Bradley seemed to be asking questions about the Mitchell family specifically. As they reached their vehicles in the parking lot, Sheriff Coleman approached them alone. "Marcus," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "I had a couple of gentlemen asking about you and your employees tonight." "Oh?" "Said they were investors, interested in energy development projects in the area. They seemed particularly curious about your family situation." Sarah stepped closer to Marcus, and he could feel tension radiating from her despite her calm expression. "They mentioned they'd visited your ranch last week," Coleman continued. "Asked whether I knew anything about the family you'd hired." "What did you tell them?" Marcus asked. "I told them the truth, that you'd hired a local family to help with ranch operations, and that they seemed like good people trying to make an honest living." Coleman paused, studying Marcus's face. "But I'll tell you, Marcus, something about those men struck me as odd." "Odd how?" "Too many questions about personal details. Most investors want to know about property values, zoning regulations, development potential. These guys wanted to know about family structures, how long you'd all been together, whether the children were enrolled in school yet." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but kept his voice level. "Maybe they're concerned about community impact." "Maybe," Coleman said, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Or maybe they're the kind of investors who prefer to do business with people who don't have local connections or community ties." The sheriff's implication was clear. He was warning them that someone was taking an unusual interest in their personal situation. I appreciate you letting us know, Sheriff, Marcus said. Just being neighborly, Coleman replied. Millfield takes care of its own, and you're part of the community now. If those men come around asking more questions, I'd like to know about it. As they drove home through the dark Montana countryside, the children chatted excitedly about the people they'd met and the invitations they'd received. Rebecca had been asked to join the school's art club. The twins had connected with boys, their own age, who were interested in 4-H activities, and Emma had received several compliments on her cornbread recipe. But in the front seat, Marcus and Sarah exchanged worried glances. He was warning us, Sarah said quietly when the children's conversation shifted to other topics. Yeah, he was. Which means Sheriff Coleman is either very good at reading people, or he knows more about our situation than he's letting on. Marcus considered this possibility, or maybe he's just a good cop who's seen enough to recognize when something doesn't add up. The question is, Sarah said, whether having local law enforcement aware of our situation helps us or puts us in more danger. As they turned into the ranch road, Marcus noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt, tracks that didn't match any of their vehicles. Sarah, he said quietly, not wanting to alarm the children. She followed his gaze to the tracks and immediately understood. Someone had been on their property while they were at the community dinner. Kids, Sarah said, turning to face the back seat. When we get to the house, I want everyone to wait in the truck while Mr. Thompson and David check things out. David's expression sharpened with alertness, and Marcus saw the teenager's hand move instinctively to the knife he always carried. Is everything okay? Emma asked, picking up on the sudden tension. Just being careful, Sarah replied. Better safe than sorry. As they approached the dark house, Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. The tire tracks could belong to innocent visitors, neighbors, delivery drivers, even teenagers using the isolated property for recreation. But given the evening's conversation with Sheriff Coleman and the mysterious interest of Western land development, innocent explanations seemed less likely. Marcus parked near the front porch but left the engine running. The house looked exactly as they'd left it, but something felt wrong. The darkness seemed too complete, the silence too absolute. David, Marcus said, grab the flashlight from the glove compartment. We're going to do a quick check of the perimeter before anyone goes inside. As the teenager prepared to accompany him, Marcus caught Sarah's eye in the rearview mirror. The look they shared conveyed a message both understood. Their new life in the open was about to face its first real test. Whether they were dealing with corporate agents, government investigators, or something else entirely, the time for hiding was officially over. From now on, they would have to defend their chosen family and their hard-won sanctuary in full view of a community that was just beginning to accept them. The $7 ranch that had promised them a fresh start was about to become a battleground. The beam of David's flashlight cut through the darkness as he and Marcus circled the house, their footsteps deliberately quiet on the frost-hardened ground. The tire tracks they'd spotted at the main road continued all the way to the house, with additional marks suggesting whoever had visited had spent considerable time examining the property. Mr. Thompson, David whispered, stopping near the kitchen window. Look at this. Marcus followed the teenager's gaze to the window frame, where scratches in the wood suggested someone had attempted to pry it open. The scratches were fresh. Wood shavings still clung to the sill. They tried to break in, Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. But they didn't succeed, David observed, running his finger along the intact window lock. Mum made sure all the windows and doors were secure before we left. They completed their circuit of the house, finding 3 more windows that showed evidence of attempted entry. Whoever had visited during their absence had been thorough and determined, but the security measures Sarah had insisted upon had held. The barn, Marcus said, and they headed across the yard. The barn doors hung open, though Marcus distinctly remembered closing them before they left for the community dinner. Inside, their living space in the loft had been systematically searched. Belongings were scattered, bedding pulled apart, and personal items examined and discarded. But the most telling discovery was what hadn't been found: the hidden compartment David had constructed beneath the loft floorboards, where they kept Robert Mitchell's environmental documents, remained untouched. The manila envelope that could destroy Hartwell Industries was still safely concealed. They were looking for something specific, David said, surveying the damage. The question is whether they found what they were looking for, Marcus replied, though he was increasingly certain that the answer was no. They returned to the truck, where Sarah and the other children waited with visible anxiety. "The house is secure," Marcus reported, "but someone searched the barn while we were gone." Sarah's expression hardened. "How bad?" "Bad enough that we know. They're serious, but not bad enough that they found anything important." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately that he was referring to her husband's hidden evidence. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, her voice smaller than usual. Marcus looked at the faces illuminated by the truck's dome light. 8 children, and their mother, all depending on him to have answers he wasn't sure he possessed. "Now we go inside, we secure the house, and we make some decisions about how we're going to handle this situation," he said, with more confidence than he felt. An hour later, the children were settled in their bedrooms with strict instructions not to leave the house without permission. Marcus and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, planning their next moves with the focused intensity of generals preparing for battle. "We have 3 options," Sarah said, consulting notes she'd made on the back of an envelope. "We can run again, we can stay and try to handle this quietly, or we can go public with Robert's evidence." "Running means starting over again," Marcus pointed out. "New identities, new location, months of hiding and hoping they don't find you. And my children never get to have normal lives," Sarah added bitterly. "Always looking over their shoulders, always ready to disappear in the middle of the night." "Going public with the evidence means immediate danger," Marcus continued. "The moment that information becomes public, everyone involved becomes a target." "But it also means the threat ends," Sarah said. "Once the information is out there, there's no point in silencing us." Marcus wasn't entirely convinced of that logic, but he understood her reasoning. "What's the third option look like?" he asked. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying his face. "We stay, we dig in, and we make ourselves too difficult and too visible to eliminate quietly." "How?" "We accelerate our plan to become indispensable to this community. We make sure that if anything happens to us, half the county will notice and ask questions." Marcus considered this approach. It was risky, but it had the advantage of allowing them to build the life they wanted, while simultaneously creating their own protection. "That means we need allies," he said. "People who will vouch for us, support us, and notice if we disappear." "Sheriff Coleman already suspects something," Sarah observed. "The question is whether he's the kind of man who can be trusted with the truth." Before Marcus could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed despite the late hour. "I've been thinking about our security situation," the teenager said without preamble. Marcus gestured for him to join them at the table. "The people who searched the barn tonight, they're professionals," David continued. "They were systematic, thorough, and they knew how to search without leaving obvious evidence. But they missed the hidden compartment, which means they're not infallible." "Your point?" Sarah asked. "My point is that if they come back, and they will come back, we need to be ready for them. Really ready." David pulled out a hand-drawn map of the ranch property, marking locations with careful precision. "I've been studying this place since we arrived," he said. "The house has good sightlines in all directions, but there are blind spots where someone could approach without being seen. The barn is too exposed to serve as a secure fallback position. But there's a root cellar behind the house that's built into the hillside. Stone construction, heavy wooden door, multiple exit routes. Marcus examined the map, impressed by the teenager's tactical thinking. "You're talking about preparing for a siege," he said. "I'm talking about being prepared to protect my family," David replied, and his voice carried the kind of quiet determination that brooked no argument. Sarah studied her son's face, seeing in it an uncomfortable reminder of his father's stubborn courage. "What kind of preparations are you thinking about?" she asked. "Communication equipment that doesn't depend on phone lines, emergency supplies stored in secure locations, early warning systems that tell us when vehicles are approaching the property." "And weapons?" Marcus asked, though he was fairly certain he already knew the answer. David's hand moved to his waistband, and for the first time, Marcus saw what the teenager had been carrying for months. A compact pistol that looked well-maintained and familiar in his hands. "Dad taught me to shoot when I was 12, David said simply. "He said a man has a responsibility to protect his family." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the kitchen windows. They were discussing preparations for armed conflict in a house filled with children, planning defenses against enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to break into homes and search through personal belongings. "There might be another way," Marcus said slowly. Both Sarah and David looked at him expectantly. "What if we force their hand? What if we make them come at us openly in a situation where they can't operate quietly?" "How?" Sarah asked. Marcus stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the ranch property that had become home to 9 people in the space of 5 weeks. "What if we announced our engagement?" he said, turning back to face them. Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "Think about it," Marcus said, his mind racing through the possibilities. A widow with 8 children marrying a local rancher is exactly the kind of story that gets attention in a small community. Church announcements, newspaper write-ups, community celebrations. "You're talking about using our personal lives as a security strategy," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm talking about creating a situation where we're so publicly connected to this community that making us disappear would require explanations that corporate assassins aren't equipped to provide." David looked back and forth between them, clearly trying to follow the implications of what Marcus was suggesting. "Would it be a real engagement?" the teenager asked bluntly. The question hung in the air between Marcus and Sarah, loaded with complications. Neither of them had been prepared to address. Marcus looked at Sarah, seeing uncertainty and calculation warring in her expression. Over the past 5 weeks, their partnership had evolved from simple necessity to something more complex: mutual respect, shared responsibility, and an affection that had grown stronger as they'd worked together to protect and provide for her children. But marriage was a different matter entirely. "It would be real enough," Marcus said carefully, "real enough to convince the community, real enough to provide legal protections, real enough to make us harder to separate." "And after?" Sarah asked quietly. "After the danger passes and we don't need the protection anymore?" Marcus met her eyes directly. "That would be up to us to figure out." David cleared his throat, reminding them that they weren't alone in the kitchen. "I think it's a good plan," the teenager said, with the straightforward practicality that Marcus had come to associate with all of Sarah's children. "Mum deserves to be happy, and you've been good to our family. If getting married helps keep us safe, then you should get married." Sarah looked at her son with an expression that mixed love, pride, and exasperation. "It's not that simple, David." "Why not?" the teenager asked. "You like him, don't you? And he obviously cares about us. We're already living like a family anyway." From the mouths of babes, Marcus thought, though he wasn't sure whether David's directness was helpful or problematic. "There's another consideration," Sarah said, and her voice carried a note of vulnerability that Marcus hadn't heard before. "If we Get married and something happens to me. What happens to my children? Marcus understood immediately. Sarah was asking about legal guardianship, about what would happen to 8 children if their mother was killed by the people hunting them. If we're married, Marcus said quietly, they become my legal responsibility. No social services intervention, no foster care placements, no breaking up the family. Sarah nodded, and Marcus could see her working through all the implications, practical, legal, emotional, and strategic. I need to think about this, she said finally. How much time do we have? David asked, ever practical. Marcus looked out the window again, noting how the darkness seemed more complete than it had earlier, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Not much, he said. Our visitors tonight were conducting reconnaissance. They'll be back, probably within the next few days, and next time they won't be satisfied with just searching the property. The next morning brought a development none of them had anticipated. Sheriff Coleman arrived at the ranch just after breakfast, his patrol car kicking up dust as he approached the house. Sarah gathered the younger children and moved them to the back of the house, while Marcus and David met the sheriff on the front porch. Morning, Marcus, Coleman said, his expression serious. We need to talk. What about? About those visitors you had last night. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. How did you know about that? Because, Coleman said, one of my deputies spotted an unfamiliar vehicle leaving your property around 11 o'clock, and I know you folks were at the community dinner until almost 10:30. The sheriff stepped closer, lowering his voice. Marcus, I don't know what kind of trouble you and that family might be in, but I want you to know that Millfield takes care of its own. If someone is threatening you or those children, I need to know about it. Marcus looked into Coleman's eyes, seeing genuine concern and professional determination. This was the moment of decision: trust local law enforcement with the truth, or continue trying to handle the situation alone. Sheriff, Marcus said quietly, there are some things about Sarah Mitchell's situation that you need to know. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Montana hills, Marcus began to tell Ray Coleman the story of Robert Mitchell's death, the environmental cover-up, and the corporate conspiracy that had made refugees of a mother and her 8 children. By the time he finished, the sheriff's expression had hardened into something that Marcus recognized as righteous anger. So you're telling me, Coleman said slowly, that some oil company murdered a whistleblower and has been hunting his family for 8 months. That's what we believe, yes. Coleman was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ranch property that had become sanctuary for 9 people who had nowhere else to run. Well then, the sheriff said finally, I guess it's time this county learned how to deal with corporate bullies. As Sarah emerged from the house with the younger children in tow, Marcus realized that their strategy of hiding in plain sight was about to get its most crucial test. They now had a law enforcement ally, but they also had enemies who were clearly escalating their efforts to eliminate the Mitchell family permanently. The question now was whether Sheriff Coleman's protection would be enough to keep them alive, long enough to figure out how to fight back. Sheriff Coleman spent the next 2 hours examining Robert Mitchell's environmental documents with the methodical attention of a man who'd built his career on understanding evidence. He sat at the kitchen table with reading glasses perched on his nose, occasionally making notes in a small notebook, while Sarah answered his detailed questions about her husband's work and the circumstances of his death. This is damning material, Coleman said finally, setting down the last report. Water contamination levels 50 times above EPA limits, falsified safety inspections, bribery of state officials. If this information had reached the federal investigators, it would have shut down Hartwell Industries permanently. Which is why they killed Robert, Sarah said quietly. Coleman removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The problem is proving that his death wasn't accidental. The accident report looks legitimate. Black ice, no witnesses. Investigation concluded within 48 hours. Too fast, David interjected from his position near the kitchen window, where he'd been maintaining watch. Dad always said that proper accident investigations take weeks, not days. Your boy's right, Coleman agreed. But proving misconduct after the fact would require resources and authority that a county sheriff doesn't have. Marcus leaned forward. What kind of resources and authority? FBI, most likely. Environmental crimes, potential murder, interstate, conspiracy. This is federal jurisdiction. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Involving federal authorities would provide maximum protection, but would also eliminate any possibility of continuing their quiet life in Millfield. There might be a middle path, Coleman continued thoughtfully. I've got a contact at the State Attorney General's office who specializes in environmental crimes. He's honest, he's aggressive, and he's got federal connections when he needs them. How much do you trust this contact? Sarah asked. With my life, Coleman replied without hesitation. Jim Brennan and I served in Vietnam together. He's the kind of prosecutor who takes environmental poisoning personally. Before anyone could respond, David's voice cut sharply from the window. 3 vehicles coming up the road, black SUVs moving fast. The kitchen erupted into controlled chaos. Sarah immediately began gathering the younger children, while Emma and the twins moved to windows facing different directions. Marcus grabbed the rifle he'd started keeping near the kitchen door, and Coleman stepped outside to his patrol car to radio for backup. How many people? Marcus called to David. At least 6, maybe 8. They're armed. I can see rifle barrels. Oh, through the windows. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't another reconnaissance mission or intimidation visit. This was an assault team coming to finish what they'd started 8 months ago. Sarah, get the kids to the root cellar, Marcus ordered. David, you go with them. I'm staying, David replied, his voice carrying the same stubborn determination that Marcus had come to associate with the entire Mitchell family. David, they're my family too, the teenager said firmly. I'm staying. Sheriff Coleman returned. From his radio call, his expression grim. Backup is 20 minutes away. We're on our own until then. The lead SUV crested the hill and accelerated toward the house, followed closely by the other 2 vehicles. Marcus could see armed figures, silhouetted in the windows, and he realized with crystal clarity that the time for negotiation and strategy had ended. Everyone who's not fighting needs to get to the cellar now, he announced. Sarah hesitated for a moment, torn between protecting her younger children and leaving her oldest son to face armed attackers. Go, Mom, David said gently. Take care of them. We'll take care of this. Sarah kissed her son's forehead, then gathered Grace, Mary, Joshua, and Rebecca, shepherding them toward the back door. Emma, now 15 and unwilling to be treated as a child, grabbed the second rifle from the gun cabinet. I can shoot, she said simply, when Marcus looked at her questioningly. The twins, Michael and Matthew, positioned themselves at windows with hunting knives their father had given them, their faces set with premature seriousness. Marcus found himself commanding a defensive force consisting of a county sheriff, a 16-year-old boy, a 14-year-old girl, and 2 12-year-old twins. Against professional killers with military-grade equipment, the odds were not encouraging. The SUVs pulled into a semicircle around the house, positioning themselves to cover all exits. Doors opened and armed figures emerged, 8 men in tactical gear carrying automatic weapons. Marcus recognized 2 of them as the Energy Development, representatives who'd visited the ranch. A voice boomed across the yard, amplified by a bullhorn. This is private security conducting a lawful investigation. We know you're harboring fugitives and stolen documents. Send out Sarah Mitchell and her children and no one gets hurt. Coleman stepped onto the front porch, his sheriff's badge clearly visible. This is Sheriff Ray Coleman, Millfield County. You're trespassing on private property with weapons. Stand down immediately. Harsh laughter echoed from the assembled men. Sheriff, You're out of your jurisdiction and over your head. Walk away, and you can go home to your family tonight." Coleman's response was to draw his service weapon and take cover behind a porch pillar. "I don't think so," he called back. "These people are under my protection." The standoff stretched for several tense minutes, both sides evaluating positions and calculating odds. Marcus used the time to check on his young defenders. David had positioned himself at the kitchen window with clear sightlines to 3 of the SUVs. His hands were steady on his rifle, and his breathing was controlled. Emma crouched by the living room window, her weapon trained on the men near the front vehicles. The twins flanked the back door, ready to prevent anyone from approaching the root cellar where their mother and younger siblings were hidden. "Mr. Thompson," David said quietly, never taking his eyes off the targets outside. "Whatever happens, don't let them take my family." "That's not going to happen," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure how he could guarantee such a promise. The attack began without warning. The men outside opened fire simultaneously, bullets shattering windows and splintering wood. Marcus dove for cover as the kitchen window exploded above his head, showering him with glass. Coleman returned fire from the porch, his shots precise and deliberate. One of the attackers stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder. The others immediately sought better cover behind their vehicles. David's rifle cracked from the kitchen, and Marcus saw another attacker spin and drop his weapon. The teenager was shooting with the calm precision of someone who'd been practicing for years. Emma's shots came more rapidly, forcing 2 men to abandon their advance toward the living room window. The twins maintained their position at the back. A door, though Marcus could see that their knuckles were white with tension, but the attackers had superior firepower and training. They began a methodical assault on the house, with some providing covering fire while others advanced. Windows shattered throughout the first floor, and bullets thudded into walls and furniture. Marcus realized they couldn't maintain this defensive position much longer. The house was taking too much damage, and they were running low on ammunition. "We need to fall back," he called to Coleman. "Where?" the sheriff replied between shots. Before Marcus could answer, the sound of additional vehicles approaching at high speed cut through the gunfire. Everyone paused, unsure whether reinforcements were arriving for the attackers or the defenders. Sheriff Coleman's radio crackled to life. "Ray, this is Deputy Martinez. We've got multiple units approaching your position. ETA 2 minutes. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but it was immediately dampened by a new sound: helicopters approaching from the south. "They brought air support," David observed with remarkable calm for someone who'd been in a gunfight for less than 10 minutes. The helicopters, 2 of them, swept over the ranch and began circling. But instead of opening fire, they began broadcasting messages. "This is the FBI. All armed personnel on the ground, lay down your weapons immediately. This property is under federal protection." Marcus looked at Coleman in amazement. "Your prosecutor friend works fast," he said. "Jim Brennan doesn't mess around when it comes to environmental criminals," Coleman replied, grinning despite the continuing gunfire. The attackers outside were clearly as surprised as everyone else by the arrival of federal agents. Their disciplined assault dissolved into confused shouting and hasty retreats toward their vehicles. But their leader, the man Marcus now knew was definitely not an energy development representative, apparently decided that retreat wasn't an option. "If we can't take them alive, we eliminate the evidence," he shouted to his remaining men. Marcus saw him pulling what looked like an incendiary grenade from his tactical vest. "He's going to burn down the house," David called out. With Sarah and 4 children still in the root cellar behind the house, fire was a death sentence for half the family. Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He stood up from behind his cover and walked toward the front door. "Marcus!" Coleman shouted. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," Marcus replied. He stepped onto the front porch, rifle lowered but ready, and called out to the man with the grenade. "You want Robert Mitchell's environmental documents?" I've got them. Right here. He held up the manila envelope that had started this entire nightmare 8 months ago. But here's the thing, Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the yard. These documents are already in the hands of federal prosecutors. Copies have been sent to the EPA, the State Attorney General, and 3 different newspapers. It was a bluff, but a convincing one. The man with the grenade hesitated, calculating whether eliminating the Mitchell family was still worth the risk if the information was already public. "You're lying," he called back. Marcus smiled grimly. "Am I? Because if I am, then you've just spent the last 8 months chasing a family that posed no actual threat to your employers." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as local law enforcement and FBI vehicles converged on the ranch. The helicopters continued their circling pattern, and Marcus could see armed agents rappelling from one of them. The leader of the attackers looked around at his remaining men, at the approaching federal agents, and at Marcus standing calmly on the porch with the documents that could destroy his employers. He dropped the grenade and raised his hands. "This isn't over," he called out as FBI agents surrounded him. "Yeah, it is," Marcus replied. As federal agents secured the scene and arrested the surviving attackers, Marcus hurried to the root cellar to retrieve Sarah and the younger children. He found them huddled together in the underground space. Sarah, clutching a pistol he hadn't known she owned, while Grace and Mary clung to her sides. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Marcus looked at this woman who'd spent 8 months protecting her children from corporate killers, who'd built a new life from nothing, who'd trusted a stranger with her family's future. "Yeah," he said, helping her to her feet. "It's over." As they emerged from the cellar into Montana sunlight that seemed brighter than it had that morning, Marcus realized that Sarah's question had multiple meanings. The immediate danger was over. The corporate conspiracy that had murdered her husband and hunted her family was finished. The documents that Robert Mitchell had died protecting were now in the hands of federal prosecutors who would use them to bring justice. But in another sense, their story was just beginning. They had a ranch to rebuild, a community that had rallied to protect them, and a future to figure out together. As Grace ran into his arms and Sarah smiled at him with relief and something deeper, Marcus understood that the $7 ranch had given him exactly what he'd been looking for without knowing. It a family worth fighting for and a purpose worth living for. The haunted ranch was haunted no more. 6 months after the FBI raid that ended their nightmare, Marcus stood in the same kitchen where he'd once planned desperate defenses against corporate killers. Now, the room buzzed with the organized chaos of a large family preparing for the most important day of their lives together. Sarah emerged from the pantry carrying a box of mason jars, her wedding dress protected by one of Marcus's old work shirts. The dress itself was simple, cream-colored cotton that she'd sewn herself with help from the women of Millfield, who had embraced the Mitchell family's story with the fierce protectiveness that small communities reserved for their own. "The flowers from Mrs. Henderson's garden are beautiful," Emma called from the living room, where she was arranging white roses and baby's breath in arrangements that would decorate the ranch for the afternoon ceremony. Marcus had initially suggested they hold the wedding in town at the Methodist church that had become the family's Sunday home. But Sarah had quietly insisted that their vows should be spoken on the land that had given them sanctuary, surrounded by the buildings they'd restored together and the horizons that promised them a future. "Dad?" Grace called, tugging on Marcus's pants leg with the casual familiarity that had developed over the months. "Dad, Rebecca says I can't carry the rings because I'm too little, but I'm 4.5 now." Marcus knelt down to Grace's eye level, still marveling at how naturally the title Dad had emerged from the younger children. It had started with Joshua, spread to Mary, and eventually been adopted by all of them except David and Emma, who maintained a more formal but equally affectionate Mr. Thompson. that somehow carried even more respect. "What do you think, Grace? Are you big enough to carry something really important?" Grace nodded solemnly. "I carried important things when we were hiding. I can carry rings." The weight of her simple statement hit Marcus with unexpected force. This little girl had spent crucial years of her childhood carrying the weight of adult fears and responsibilities. Today, she would carry symbols of love and commitment instead. "Then you'll be our ring bearer," Marcus said, kissing her forehead. "But you have to promise to walk very slowly down the aisle." "I promise," Grace said, then scampered off to inform Rebecca that the matter had been officially settled. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the new suit that Marcus had bought him for the occasion. At 17 now, he'd grown 3 inches over the winter and gained the kind of solid muscle that came from ranch work and good nutrition. But more importantly, he'd gained something Marcus recognized as peace, the relaxed posture of someone who no longer had to be constantly ready for danger. "The guests are starting to arrive," David reported. "Sheriff Coleman just pulled up with his wife, and I can see at least 6 more cars coming up the road." Marcus looked out the window at the approaching vehicles, still amazed by how thoroughly the Millfield community had embraced his unlikely family. The guest list for today's wedding included nearly half the town. Families who'd met the Mitchells at church potlucks, children who'd become classmates and friends with Sarah's kids, business owners who discovered that the haunted ranch had become one of the county's most successful agricultural operations. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first months after the FBI raid had been a complex mixture of legal proceedings, media attention, and gradual community acceptance. Federal prosecutors had used Robert Mitchell's evidence to build cases against 17 Hartwell Industries executives, including charges of murder, conspiracy, and environmental terrorism. The company itself had been dissolved, its assets seized. To pay for environmental cleanup and victim compensation, Sarah had received a settlement that ensured her children's educational futures and eliminated the financial desperation that had driven them into hiding. But more importantly, she'd received something that money couldn't buy: vindication for her husband's sacrifice and justice for his death. The media attention had been intense, but brief. For 2 weeks, the story of the murdered whistleblower's family had dominated environmental news cycles. Then, as news cycles always do, it had moved on to other stories, leaving the Mitchell family to rebuild their lives in relative privacy. Marcus walked to the living room, where the rest of the wedding preparations were taking shape. The twins, now 13 and showing signs of becoming formidable teenagers, were setting up chairs borrowed from the Methodist church. 10-year-old Rebecca was directing the placement of flower arrangements with the artistic eye she'd discovered during her first year at Millfield Elementary. 8-year-old Joshua was helping his older brothers carry equipment for the small band that would provide music for the ceremony. Emma, now 15 and showing clear signs of inheriting her mother's organizational abilities, consulted the clipboard. That had become her trademark. "Pastor Williams should be here in 20 minutes, she announced. "The cake is ready in the kitchen. The photographer from the newspaper said she'd be here by 2, and Aunt Linda's flight landed in Billings an hour ago." Aunt Linda was Sarah's sister from Oregon, the only family member who'd maintained contact during the months of hiding. She'd arrived the previous day with stories, photographs, and connections to Sarah's past that helped fill in gaps that the children had never known about their mother's life before marriage and motherhood. Marcus had worried about meeting Sarah's sister, uncertain how she would react to the man who'd married into the family under such unusual circumstances. But Linda had embraced him with genuine warmth, thanking him for giving her sister and nephew and nieces the stability they desperately needed. "You know," Linda had said quietly the night before, as they sat on the front porch watching the children play in the yard, "Sarah was always the strongest person I knew, but she was never happier than she is now." Even after everything that happened, Marcus had asked. Especially after everything that happened, Linda replied. She learned what she was really made of, and so did her children. And they learned that there are still good people in the world who'll stand up for what's right. Now, as Marcus watched his soon-to-be family preparing for the ceremony that would make their bonds official, he reflected on how much had changed. Since that October day when he'd bought a haunted ranch for $7, the ranch itself had been transformed. The house had been fully renovated, with modern plumbing, updated electrical systems, and enough bedrooms to give each child their own space. The barn had been converted into a combination workshop and equipment storage facility. New outbuildings housed the cattle operation that had become the ranch's primary income source, but the real transformation had been in the people. Marcus had discovered that loneliness wasn't just about being alone. It was about lacking purpose and connection. Managing a household of 8 children and supporting Sarah's dreams had given him both in abundance. Sarah had bloomed in ways that went beyond simple security. Released from the constant fear and stress of hiding, she'd revealed talents for business management, community organizing, and education that had made her an invaluable partner in every sense. She'd also begun writing. First, a detailed account of their experiences that had been published by a major environmental magazine, and more recently, a children's book series about courage and family that had attracted interest from publishers. The children had thrived in ways that still amazed Marcus. David had been accepted to Montana State University with a scholarship that would allow him to study environmental engineering while continuing to help manage the ranch. Emma had discovered a passion for journalism and had become the star reporter for the Millfield High School newspaper. The twins had found their niche in 4-H programs, raising prize-winning cattle that had become the foundation of the ranch's breeding program. Rebecca had emerged as an artist whose paintings of ranch life were displayed in the Millfield Library and had won several regional competitions. Joshua had developed into a natural horseman whose skill had attracted attention from professional trainers. Mary had become the family's unofficial veterinarian, with an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed even Dr. Patterson, the county's longtime large animal veterinarian. And Grace had simply become the heart of the family. The child whose laughter filled rooms, whose questions sparked conversations, and whose unconditional love had taught Marcus things about himself that he'd never suspected. Pastor Williams arrived precisely on time, carrying the Bible he'd used for hundreds of weddings over his 30-year ministry. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd embraced the Mitchell family's story as an example of divine providence working through human courage. "Beautiful day for a wedding," he observed, looking out at the Montana landscape that stretched to the horizon under a perfect blue sky. "Beautiful day for everything," Sarah replied, appearing in the living room in her wedding dress, with her hair arranged in a simple style that Marcus thought made her look radiant. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock when the afternoon. Light would be perfect for photographs and the mountain air would be cool enough for comfort. Guests continued to arrive, families from town, neighboring ranchers, federal agents who'd become friends during the legal proceedings, and even Jim Brennan, the state prosecutor whose quick action had saved their lives. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of having no family of his own to invite to his wedding. His parents had died years earlier, and he'd lost touch with most relatives during the difficult years after his divorce. But as he watched the Mitchell children greeting guests and introducing him as "our dad," he realized that family wasn't always about blood relationships. At 2:45, David approached Marcus with a serious expression. "Mr. Thompson," he said formally, "I have something I need to say to you before the ceremony." Marcus felt a moment of apprehension. In the months since they'd become a family, David had been unfailingly supportive of Marcus's relationship with his mother. But Marcus knew that the teenager still carried the weight of feeling responsible for his siblings' welfare. "What's on your mind, David?" "I want to thank you," David said simply, "for giving us a home, for protecting us, for making my mom happy, and for being the kind of man my dad would have respected." The words hit Marcus with unexpected emotional force. He'd wondered many times whether Robert Mitchell would have approved of another man raising his children and marrying his wife. Hearing David's assessment meant more than any official blessing could have. "Your father raised an exceptional young man," Marcus replied. "I'm honored to be part of his family." At exactly 3 o'clock, the wedding ceremony began. The guests arranged themselves in chairs facing the front porch, with the Montana landscape providing a backdrop that no church could match. Pastor Williams took his position, and the small band began playing the processional music Sarah had chosen. Emma walked down the makeshift aisle first, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers and wearing a shy smile that transformed her into the beautiful young woman she was becoming. The twins followed, serving as ushers and looking remarkably mature in their matching suits. Rebecca came next, scattering rose petals with artistic precision. Joshua walked beside her, carrying the family Bible that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. Then Grace appeared, walking with careful concentration as she carried the rings on a small pillow that Linda had embroidered with the date and the names of everyone in the family. Finally, Sarah began her walk down the aisle, with David proudly serving as the man to give her away. She had chosen not to wear a veil, saying that she'd spent enough of her life hiding behind barriers and disguises. As she approached the front porch where Marcus waited, he saw in her face the same strength that had enabled her to protect 8 children against impossible odds, the same determination that had built a new life from nothing, and the same love that had transformed a lonely rancher into the father of a remarkable family. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, "we are gathered here today to celebrate the marriage of Marcus Thompson and Sarah Mitchell, and the joining of their families into one united household." The ceremony was traditional in structure, but personal in content. They had written their own vows, promising not just to love and honor each other, but to protect and nurture the family they'd created together. When Marcus promised to love Sarah's children as his own, Grace called out, "He already does," which caused laughter that rippled through the assembled guests. When Sarah promised to build a future with Marcus that honored the past while embracing new possibilities, Linda wiped away tears that spoke of relief and joy. And when Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that arose from the children was so enthusiastic that it startled a flock of geese from the ranch pond. The reception that followed was a celebration that reflected the community the Mitchell family had found in Millfield. Sheriff Coleman made a toast that referenced the family's courage in the face of danger. Mrs. Henderson from the general store presented Sarah with a quilt made by the church ladies, featuring squares that depicted scenes from ranch life. Jim Brennan, the prosecutor, spoke about the importance of ordinary people who were willing to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was enormous. But it was David who made the toast that brought tears to every adult eye in the gathering. 6 months ago, he said, standing with remarkable poise for someone who'd just turned 17, my family was hiding in a barn, afraid of every car that came down the road, wondering if we'd ever have a normal life again. He looked around, at the faces gathered on the ranch that had become home. Today, my mom married a man who gave us more than just shelter and safety. He gave us a future. And all of you gave us something we didn't even know we'd lost. A community that cares about its own. David raised his glass of lemonade. The ranch remained alcohol-free in deference to the younger children. Here's to new beginnings, chosen family, and $7 investments that turn into priceless treasures. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that seemed created specifically for this moment, Marcus stood with his arm around his new wife, watching their children play with the neighbor kids in the yard of the ranch that had given them all a second chance. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus looked at the house they'd rebuilt together, the land they were turning into a profitable operation, the children who'd made him understand what it meant to be needed and loved unconditionally. "Just one," he said. Sarah looked at him with concern. "I wish I'd bid $8, Marcus said with a grin, "just to make sure nobody else could outbid me." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch yard where their children were building the memories that would define their futures. In the distance, the lights of Millfield twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder of the community that had embraced them and the normal life they'd thought was impossible. The haunted ranch was haunted no more. Instead, it was home to a family bound not by blood alone, but by the stronger ties of choice, courage, and love. And sometimes, Marcus reflected, as Grace ran up to show him a firefly she'd caught, the best investments were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.